In the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, readers might find more than just a creation story, or the fall of man, or the somewhat trigger-happy deity that isn't afraid to drop bombs on entire cities. There's a treasure trove of characters that are often overlooked. There are complex narratives that fall into the periphery when compared to some of the more popular stories. And of course, there are complicated relationships between men and women, some of which see drastic outcomes for those involved. It is these women who we'll be focusing on today, and exploring how these characters are not merely ancillary to the more male-inspired narratives, but actually integral to some of the more theological and moral lessons that Genesis might impart. Eve. Known as the very first woman, Genesis tells readers that Eve was created from the rib of Adam, the first man, who conversely had been created from the dust of the ground. Now, where Adam had been charged to manage and maintain the Garden of Eden, Eve had been created so as to be his companion, a helper, someone to keep him company so that he might not get lonely. After her creation, God explained to Adam and Eve that they were free to sample any of the fruit in the Garden of Eden. However, they were forbidden from eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This, God told them, was fatal, and that they ought to have kept well away from this tree. Subsequently, we see the emergence of the cunning serpent, who tempted Eve into tasting this very fruit. The serpent claimed that there was nothing wrong with eating from this particular tree, and that even though God had promised it would be fatal, the serpent assured her it would open her eyes, and that after tasting the fruit, she would become just like God. Once Eve understood that the fruit was not just pleasing to the eye, but also came with these additional benefits, she acted against the warnings of God and took some of the fruit for herself. Here she also gave some to her husband Adam, who also indulged in the fruit. The narrative does not give us any inclination as to who Eve was in terms of characteristics and personality. However, it might be deduced that based on the fact that both Adam and Eve had no knowledge of good and evil at that time, there was surely a blissful naivety about them. Eve, like Adam, had no previous experiences nor perspectives to draw from, and so it's reasonable to say that Eve was an innocent, if not simple being who for the most part was content with her surroundings and her occupation. However, you might also argue that Eve was a curious being, curiosity being one of the traits that spearheaded her expulsion from the Garden of Eden. After learning from the serpent that there was more to this forbidden fruit than just taste, Eve was overcome with interest. It was with her curiosity of the unknown, and perhaps her desire for the fabled promises of the serpent, did Eve choose to ignore the caution of her God, and indulged in her own fancy for knowledge and satisfaction. Many have drawn comparisons from Eve to that of Pandora in Greek mythology, who after being told to never open the divine gift from the gods, could not help herself, and ended up unleashing every calamity into the world as a result of her impulsiveness and inquisitiveness. In the same vein, many scholars blame Eve for the same transgression, who after being warned by God not to eat from the tree of knowledge, could not help herself from tasting the fruit and incurring a similar punishment. The difference is that the calamities and horrors that are released unto the world in Pandora's case affect everyone. Such was the result of Pandora's curiosity and desire. In the Genesis story though, the punishment for Eve's disobedience would come to affect not only herself, but all other women. God declared unto Eve that as a result of her disobedience, all women thereafter would be subjected to painful agony during childbirth, as well as subjugation to their husbands. Sarai, or Sarah. We first find Sarai in a similar situation to that of several women within the biblical narrative, that she's unable to conceive. This is essentially the only information we are given on Sarai in the early parts of her story, and may tie in with the punishment earned by Eve that women would play second fiddle to their arguably more important husbands, in this case, Abram. Indeed, much of this arc of Genesis is focused around Abram earning the covenant of the Lord and establishing his own lineage as that which would be blessed by God. It isn't until God tells Abram to go to Egypt do we see Sarai step into a more independent role, establishing herself as a more memorable character with significant beauty and, for some scholars, a part of the very first biblical scandal. You see, when Abram goes down to Egypt, he becomes very fearful that the men here would not be able to resist Sarai's beauty. This isn't necessarily the insecurities of a man who was punching out of his league, but in fact a very legitimate concern as far as some biblical commentators are concerned. Sarai wasn't just attractive by this logic. She actually was probably one of the best looking women that most men in these regions had ever seen. It's therefore not completely far-fetched to consider that based on this idea, Sarai's presence in Egypt wouldn't have had the men just turning their heads, but instead would entice them to kill Abram and steal her for themselves. Abram was so concerned about this that he lied to the men he came across, telling them that Sarai was his sister, not his wife. Not only would this spare him of being killed by the men, for he would have eliminated himself as being a sexual rival by identifying as her brother, but it would also see him treated well by the men, who would want to put their best foot forward with Sarai by showing respect to her brother. Abram's predictions come to pass, and under the ruse that this beautiful woman is his sister, is treated well by the Egyptians. However, it isn't long before the pharaoh of the land hears about Sarai's beauty and demands he sees it for himself. Here we see Sarai essentially passed around like cattle. She is taken by Pharaoh, which some scholars believe that in her efforts to maintain the ruse meant that she did have to end up sleeping with him. All the while, Abram was given gifts and was treated like royalty. The Bible isn't explicit as to whether or not Sarai did have to sleep with Pharaoh. There is this lingering curiosity of did they or didn't they that permeates this chapter. On the one hand, it's unlikely that Abram's God would have allowed Sarai to be violated like this, but on the other hand, Pharaoh does say that he took Sarai to be his wife, leading to him and his household to be cursed with a plague. Sarai's obedience here is quite a contrast to the character we later see her become. At this point, her lack of dialogue conveys her as subservient, acquiescent, and despite her undeniable beauty, her lack of resistance to Abram's plans and her submission to Pharaoh has her come across as vacant. Either this was her own grim acknowledgement that Abram's plan was necessary, albeit irregular, or an indication of her youth and timidness. The reason I say this is because by chapter 16, it is Sarai who is calling the shots. It is Sarai who so desperately wants a baby that she convinces her husband to sleep with her handmaiden Hagar, and then later blames him when she becomes jealous that the handmaiden is pregnant. This is not the same Sarai who wordlessly agreed to her husband's schemes, but now a woman who was creating the schemes herself, and putting her husband in the center of them. Once the covenant is established between God and Abram is actually renamed by God and called Abraham, while Sarai becomes Sarah. It is here that God tells Abram that his wife will give birth at the age of 90. Now, if you think that's ridiculous, well, you're in good company, because Abraham thought it was ridiculous too, and even laughed when God told him. That laughter is later shared by Sarah once she gives birth to her son Isaac, again at 90 years old, where she says, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And everyone did laugh. Well, everyone except this next disgruntled lady. Hagar. As previously mentioned, when Sarai became desperate for a child, she orchestrated a sort of one-night stand between her husband Abram and her handmaiden Hagar, in the hopes that Hagar would become pregnant and then give the baby to her. Through this, Sarai could have the family she always wanted, even if the baby wasn't biologically hers. Now, whilst all this does transpire, Sarai did not account for the jealousy she would experience towards Hagar. She begins to despise Hagar and tells Abram that now that she was pregnant with his child, she did not act as a handmaiden should, but rather held the pregnancy over her head. We don't know for sure if Hagar did this, or if she acted haughty or out of line, but we know that Sarai perceived this as happening. Nonetheless, she became so outraged by Hagar and her pregnancy that she began to mistreat the handmaiden, so much so that Hagar actually fled. It was a pretty big deal for a woman to flee in those days. It wasn't as if she was moving to the next town over to start anew, but was rather moving out of the safety of the settlement and into the wilderness of the desert. One may see this as a testament to Hagar's character, that she was brave enough to even risk leaving the employ of Sarai and striking out on her own, whilst pregnant no less. Yet another interpretation is that this was a sign of how bad the mistreatment had gotten at the hands of Sarai, that Hagar would have rather taken her chances out in the wild than spent another day at the mercy of her mistress. Luckily though, Hagar does not run into any wild animals or bandits while out in the wilderness, but rather runs into an angel. Here the angel comforts her, but also tells her that she must return to Sarai, for if she does, he will ensure that her descendants would be numerous. With this promise, Hagar agrees to return to Sarai, and whilst we cannot be sure if her mistreatment continued, it probably did. At the very least, we know that Hagar gave birth to a son named Ishmael. Later, however, when Isaac is born, Sarah's resentment of Hagar and her son Ishmael is far from forgotten. She interprets a gesture from Ishmael as mocking Isaac and instructs Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. With a heavy heart, Abraham does agree, but his God promises that he will look after him. When Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, they roamed the Beersheba desert, where eventually that same angel returned to Hagar and led them to the direction of water. After that, we are told that Hagar and Ishmael lived in the desert, presumably under the watchful eye of the angel, where she later acquired a wife for Ishmael in Egypt. One of the most striking things that some readers find about Hagar is that she doesn't seem to do anything wrong. Indeed, the haughtiness she expresses over Sarai can be chalked up to a warped interpretation by Sarai, who by that point not only regretted her decision to have her husband sleep with her, but was also overcome with resentment and envy. Outside of this, Hagar seems like the dutiful handmaiden. She agrees to sleep with Sarai's husband in the first place. She goes above and beyond in her duties in that respect. And even though she completes these arguably degrading tasks, sleeping with an 84-year-old man can't be that fun, she is still scorned for her efforts thereafter. Perhaps this is why an angel is sent to Hagar in the first place, because she is one of the unsung biblical characters who goes through quite the ordeal for very little reward. Lot's wife. I'm sure we've all heard the expression wrong place, wrong time, and that kind of applies to Lot's wife. We don't really know much about Lot's wife. We don't even know her name, but she does nonetheless make an interesting case study when considering curiosity and temptation. As readers may know, in the moments before Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by God, Lot is urged by the angels to hurry up and leave. However, Lot is more concerned about where it is he is going to run to. So with the angels in agreement, they decide that Lot should be able to flee to a small town known as Zoar, but that if he should take this route, he and his family should not look back at the destruction of the two cities. Lot agrees, but as he and his family are fleeing from the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's wife looks back. Now, we don't know why she looked back, but it's reasonable to deduce that anyone in those circumstances would be tempted to have a peek. Call it morbid curiosity or the desire to witness a dangerous phenomena, but it's the same reason why we might not be able to avert our eyes from, say, a train crash. Lot's wife probably never meant to disobey the angels, nor did she have any ill intent, but considering the sheer scale of the disaster literally unfolding behind her, it's pretty conceivable that most of us would have probably looked back, if only to make sure we were getting as far away from the blast radius as we possibly could. In any case, for her disobedience, she is punished and quite randomly turned into a pillar of salt. It isn't clear if this may have been because of the salt that rained down from the skies with brimstone, or if her remains were coated in salt later, preserving her corpse in this pillaresque shape. Another idea as to why she was punished at all is because Lot's wife didn't just look back at the destruction of the two cities, but rather looked back and felt sorrow and longing for two cities that she loved. These places of sin and debauchery were her home, and by looking back for more than just a brief glance, was indicative of how much she valued Sodom and Gomorrah, and how her morals and ethics were incongruent with the biblical gods. Lot's daughters. Lot's wife isn't the only woman who earned herself in the biblical Hall of Fame for all the wrong reasons, but at least there's an argument that Lot's wife didn't knowingly do wrong. His daughters, on the other hand, were truly built differently. In the aftermath of the Sodom and Gomorrah decimation, Lot and his two daughters settled in the mountains. Indeed, they were meant to go to Zoar, but something seemed to have spooked them, and they ended up going to live in a cave. Now, the older daughter became concerned that there were no men living in these mountains, so there was no way for them to get pregnant and have children of their own. So with this conundrum, they decided to get their father drunk, and then, essentially, force themselves upon him. To Lot's credit, we are told that he was completely unaware that they were even doing this. Some scholars attempt to focus on the youthful naivety of the daughters, and that they wanted to be like other women, and that they may not have known exactly what they were doing. But the Bible never gives us anything else on the subject. We aren't even told of Lot's reaction here, but merely told that the descendants of these two daughters would become the fathers of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Rebekah. The discovery of Isaac's wife Rebekah is down to the diligence of Abraham's senior servant, who, after being tasked by Abraham to find his son a wife, pretty much just picks the first woman he sees. Of course, it's not that simple. The senior servant headed down to the town of Nahor, and came to a stop just outside the town where the well was. Here he waited, knowing full well that the women of Nahor would soon come to draw water. Here he would have the pick of the women without having to go door to door to inspect the daughters of the land. As if this wasn't easy enough though, the servant asked his God to have the woman who was the most compassionate identify herself, and that it was this woman who would be deemed compatible and appropriate for Isaac. When Rebekah emerged, she was described as being very beautiful. Perhaps not so beautiful that all the men in Egypt would kill her prospective suitors just to have her, but beautiful nonetheless. What sets Rebekah apart from the likes of Sarah is indeed her compassion and generosity, for when she approaches the senior servant at the well, she not only offered him her water, but also offered to feed and clean his camels. With this gesture, the senior servant knew he had found the perfect wife for Isaac, one who was not only beautiful, but willing to go above and beyond, who was courteous, polite, and humble. In fact, we even see examples of her modesty when she later agrees to meet with Isaac, for when she saw him, she adorned herself with a veil before marrying him. By comparison, Rebekah appears to be one of the less complicated characters, at least as far as a wife goes. She and Isaac appear to get on without major dispute, and there is no sign of any schemes or jealousies as there are in Abraham and Sarah's marriage. One might argue that Rebekah was quite an agreeable person. She had grown up serving her father and her brother Laban. She was used to a lifestyle that saw her in the service of men. And so serving Isaac in the same way was not too far out of her regular routine. We are told that she loved Isaac and that he loved her. So even with this more one-sided dynamic, there certainly seems to be more cohesiveness between them than any other marriage that transpires in Genesis. It's the relationship between her children that puts Rebekah in a more controversial spotlight, namely her blatant favoritism over her second son Jacob. She goes to some great lengths to not only put Jacob above her firstborn Esau, but is also complicit in deceiving a wary and old Isaac into surrendering his inheritance and blessing solely to Jacob. The Bible does tell us that whilst Isaac loved the firstborn Esau, Rebekah loved the secondborn Jacob. suggesting that the parents did pick their favourites and made it known through their actions which child they preferred. The only difference is that Rebekah goes out of her way to ensure that Jacob is essentially set for life, even if this comes at the expense of the oldest son Esau. Rebekah never seems to receive any comeuppance for her hand in the deception. In fact, she almost seems to double down by warning Jacob that his brother is on the warpath and looking for vengeance. Whether her actions can be justified or not, the narrative does show us how this seldom mentioned and often unsung woman of Genesis essentially changed the course of the entire chapter. As the firstborn, Esau was naturally meant to receive his father's blessing and inheritance, but Rebekah is seen to unapologetically become the mastermind behind the plot to promote Jacob instead. This sees the biblical story follow the rather influential path of Jacob, and as a result, renders Esau as something more akin to a footnote, rather than a pivotal character. Leah. The story of Leah goes hand in hand with her sister Rachel, but first it might be helpful to know how these two troubled sisters come onto the scene. After Jacob flees from his brother Esau, he ends up in the household of his uncle Laban, where he falls in love with Laban's daughter Rachel. Now Laban promised that if Jacob worked for him for 7 years, he would give him Rachel as a wife. However, after completing his 7 years, Laban tricked Jacob into sleeping with Leah. Upon realizing that this was not the correct sister, Jacob demands that he is given Rachel instead. Here, Laban alters the deal and tells Jacob that he has to marry Leah first, and that after her bridal week, he can then marry Rachel too. I suppose you might think of it as a buy one get one free bargain. It's often proposed by commentators that Leah was the ugly sister, the older sister that no one really wanted. The Bible describes her as having weak eyes, whilst her sister Rachel is described as being beautiful and having a lovely figure. By this, it can be deduced that Leah wasn't much in the looks department, and considering she was older than Rachel, it's probable that Laban had a hard time finding any man who wanted to marry her. As far as the narrative goes, Leah was always the second choice. She was a woman who would have likely been spurned in favour of her prettier younger sister. In fact, Genesis makes it pretty clear that Jacob loved Rachel more than he did Leah, and that he only slept with Leah so as to fulfill his husbandly duties. It's pretty hard not to have sympathy for Leah and view her as one of the more tragic women of the Bible. Even God takes pity on Leah and allows her to give birth to several of Jacob's children, whilst Rachel, his true love, delivers him none for a time. What's sad about Leah is that even after experiencing such shunning and being more of a chore for Jacob than a wife, she still wants him to love her, or at least wants to experience love, hoping that after each baby she births will win over his affections. Unfortunately, she is left wanting. Rachel. As mentioned, Rachel was the true love of Jacob and the only wife that he really wanted. Whilst never confirmed in Genesis, we get the idea that Rachel enjoyed her life of beauty and was not able to truly empathize with Leah in regards to what it meant to be the ugly sister. She is never seen to show compassion to Leah, nor really attempt to understand her sister's predicament in that she was forced to marry Jacob too. Instead, she grows venomously bitter and jealous over Leah, particularly over how Leah was able to deliver so many children to Jacob, whereas she could not. This caused a rift between Jacob and Rachel, who became so desperate for children that she actually permitted Jacob to sleep with her servant Bilhah, so that she may have the child that was born between them as her own. This calms the rivalry between Rachel and Leah for a time, but it isn't long before the two women begin accusing each other of husband stealing, and later even the stealing of mandrakes. One of the root causes of the problem, according to some scholars, is that Leah had spent her entire life in Rachel's shadow, constantly jealous over her beauty and the affections she received. Now the shoe was on the other foot in some respects, considering it was the first time that Rachel had found herself in a position to be jealous of Leah, for all the children she had given birth to. The two sisters aren't able to be happy for each other in the slightest, and as a result of their own individual successes, they devolve into bitter siblings who greatly dislike each other. Through these sisters, we once again encounter women who are able to get the upper hand over their male spouses, and perhaps, in some way, even achieve power over the relationship. You'll notice that both Leah and Rachel end up pimping Jacob out to their servants in an effort to attain more children, and whilst it isn't clear if Jacob is willingly obliging in these undertakings, he isn't exactly given a choice either. Readers may notice that Leah even told Jacob that she had hired him to sleep with her servant at one point, making Jacob seem much less like a husband and more like a servant for which she was using to achieve her goal. Bilhah. Known as Laban's handmaiden originally, and then later as Rachel's, Bilhah is one of the servants chosen by Rachel to sleep with Jacob in an effort to attain a son. Bilhah would give birth to two sons in Dan and Naphtali, whom Rachel would claim as her own. Beyond this, very little is known of Bilhah, other than her becoming Jacob's concubine in some translations. However, she does become embroiled in a scandal later on, where after the death of Rachel, Jacob did not default to Leah, but rather preferred Bilhah the servant over her. The idea, according to some commentators, is that because Bilhah had been Rachel's handmaiden, she had trained the woman to retain closeness to Jacob and to essentially become like her. However, we are later told that Reuben, Leah's oldest son, ended up sleeping with Bilhah behind his father's back, which then earned Reuben the cold shoulder and the loss of his father's respect. Some commentators interpret the story differently, with Reuben having motive to sleep with his father's concubine so as to spite him for not prioritizing his mother Leah, whilst others chalk Reuben's transgression up to simple lust. Dinah. The daughter of Leah and Jacob, Dinah is another lesser-known woman in the Bible, and yet one who is a precursor to a rather insidious event. By the events of chapter 34 in Genesis, we see Dinah visit the women of Shechem, where her father Jacob had purchased land. Here she ran into the prince of the land, also named Shechem, who we are told took her and raped her. When Dinah returned home, she told her many brothers of the incident, and naturally, they became enraged. But they controlled their anger, biding their time for when the opportunity of revenge would present itself. And present itself it did, when Shechem later arrived on their doorstep asking to marry Dinah. Now, the brothers of Dinah did agree to Shechem's proposal, but only agreed to the marriage if the men of his household agreed to be circumcised. After the men had been circumcised and were recovering from the procedure, the sons of Jacob, specifically Simeon and Levi, took their swords and attacked Shechem unaware, slaying Shechem, his father, and all the males who were incapacitated. Beyond this, we don't get much more information on Dinah besides her encounter with Shechem, where she was defiled. We don't know if she was in support of her brother's actions, nor in fact whether she was actually taken against her will, for there exists much debate around this particular claim. Furthermore, we never learn of Dinah's fate, leaving us with the question as to whether she married someone else or whether she got to have her own family. Tamar. We've seen that while the women of Genesis may not have had the same rights as men, nor were they considered as important as the male characters, they did have their ways of asserting their own power, whether this be through their own courage or through some kind of deception. There probably isn't a better example in Genesis of the dichotomy between courage and deception than the character Tamar, who was the daughter-in-law of Judah, a son of Jacob. Tamar was married to Judah's son but when was struck down by God for being wicked, Tamar was passed on to Judah's son Onan, as was customary in those days, to preserve the lineage of the deceased brother. Onan, however, didn't much like this arrangement, and so when he was forced to have sex with Tamar, he would pull out and spill his semen on the ground. To this, God was aggravated, and so he struck down Onan too. Whilst readers know that God had killed Judah's sons, Judah did not. In fact, he blamed Tamar for the death of his sons and began to suspect that she was cursed, and that any of the men she slept with were fated to perish soon after. With this notion, Judah was reluctant to offer Tamar his last remaining son, Shelah, who was at that time too young to marry. Instead of setting Tamar free, Judah sent Tamar to live with her father as a widow, where she could not remarry and was essentially banned from starting a family of her own. Now, Tamar was under the impression that she was waiting for Shelah to come of age, but when it became clear to her that this was not the case, she took matters into her own hands. She devised a plan whereby she seduced her father-in-law Judah. She covered herself with a veil so that he would not recognize her, and took on the guise of a prostitute, appeasing Judah's venereal side. Judah offered to pay a pledge to who he believed to be a random prostitute with his seal and his staff, and once this was agreed upon, Judah unknowingly had sex with his daughter-in-law. The strategy of Tamar's plan came into fruition when it was revealed that she was pregnant. Judah, as head of the family, was outraged by this, and commanded that Tamar be burned to death for her sin. As she was about to be burned, Tamar presented Judah's seal and staff, and told all that the father of her child was the owner of these items. Realizing that he had essentially been played by Tamar, Judah publicly announced his involvement, as well as Tamar's innocence. In fact, he even declared that she was more right than he was, perhaps an admittance that he had treated her unfairly and ultimately been trumpeted by her grand design. Potiphar's wife. Yet another biblical woman who can only be identified by her association to her husband. Potiphar's wife becomes one of the last women in Genesis to really leave a mark on the main character and the overall narrative. When Jacob's son Joseph was sold into Egyptian slavery and later came into the service of Potiphar, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard, he caught the eye of his master's wife. It is when Potiphar was away and his wife was alone with Joseph did she risk it all, and with no real hesitation, requested that Joseph sleep with her. Joseph, though, was a loyal servant, and though he was probably attracted to Potiphar's wife, did not give in to his temptation. He rejected Potiphar's wife on the grounds that her husband had been good to him, and that both he and her husband were honourable men. Furthermore, Joseph would not sleep with her, knowing that this would not only wrong Potiphar, but also be a disgrace in the eyes of his God. Far be it from Potiphar's wife to accept such a rejection though. After all, we are led to believe that she was a beautiful woman, and was probably not used to experiencing such rejection. Furthermore, Joseph is equally described as a very attractive man, and so her lust for him was not something that could be so easily shut down. It is what prompted her to try her luck again, for when the men of the house were absent, and there was only herself and Joseph in the house, Potiphar's wife propositions Joseph once more. This time though, Joseph removed himself from the situation and fled from the house. However, in the effort of manoeuvring out of her embrace, he left one of his garments in her hand. Scorned by yet another rejection, Potiphar's wife retained this item of clothing and presented it to her husband, declaring that this was proof that he had tried to lie with her. Trusting his wife's accusation, Potiphar apprehended Joseph and threw him in prison. The women of Genesis, from Eve to even Potiphar's wife, present a multifaceted portrayal of very real human characteristics: faith, resilience, lust, deception, sacrifice, mirrors to our very own lives perhaps. Their stories are not mere footnotes as one might initially assume, especially in comparison to the patriarchal narratives, but are actually integral to God's unfolding plan. Each woman's journey, marked by personal challenges, divine encounters, and pivotal roles in the lineage of Israel, reveals the profound impact they had on their families and the broader biblical narrative. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.